in graduate school. After graduating, what led you to kind of go into teaching philosophy as a career?
Yeah, I was really happy to find a teaching forward position like OHS because I was finding in graduate school, we teach one class per semester as we're doing our um, research. I found that teaching was really what got me out of bed in the morning because I got to interact with other people.
Hmm.
I felt like I was really helping in a way that was sometimes harder to see with, writing articles or something like that. Every day you could see on people's faces the impact
Yeah.
that it had on them. And I also found that, like, for me, a lot of the intellectual joy I find in philosophy is in explaining it. Because philosophy has a structure where, like, and I'm sure any student at OHS knows this experience, it's written
Hmm.
really densely and it's really confusing and it's very unclear at first when you read it. And it's often intimidating, right? And it can
Yeah.
make some people feel like a kind of imposter syndrome where they go, well, I don't know what's going on here, so I'm going to stay away from this, right? Um,
Mhm.
but I think one thing that I find really satisfying is translating things that are really complicated into really simple language. And I think that's one of the jobs of a philosophy teacher is to say, what's a good example? Um, Anselm's ontological argument. When you first read it, you might get a grasp of it, but you can only explain it using these like 8 syllable words and these really convoluted things. But once you get it a couple times, and the teacher can do this because engaged with it a couple times, you can say the essence of the argument is that God exists by definition.
Right.
So people who um, say that God doesn't exist aren't just mistaken; they don't understand the words they're using. And why is that? Because God is by definition perfect, and if God didn't exist, God wouldn't be perfect. Right?
Mhm.
Um, so if you could take something really complicated and distill it down into everyday language, right? I find that really satisfying, and I feel like teaching really helps me do that. And it's satisfying as a puzzle for me, but it's also satisfying because I feel like it empowers students to help them move from a point where at first they say, this is intimidating, I don't get it, to, oh, I get what this says, and I can do something with it, and I have thoughts about this. And that makes me really happy.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's definitely a process going from kind of like the more convoluted language people usually write philosophy in to that sort of like everyday language, simple ideas, examples, things like that that people can understand. And
Yeah, and I think, oh, sorry, I'll jump in and say, I take as my model for that
yeah.
Socrates, right? Because Socrates was, walking around barefoot in Athens, and he was surrounded by people who, in Athenian democracy, um, the ability to speak eloquently was a significant source of social capital, right?
Mhm.
Because it was a direct democracy, and a lot of the debates were verbal debates, not just op-eds in newspapers and things like that. Um, and so people would there was a substantial career of people who would go around teaching you how to speak eloquently. But a lot of that was BSing, right? I was teaching people
Mhm.
how to sound like you know what you're talking about when you don't. Um, and people get a lot of money for teaching this. And Socrates would go up to these people, and this is the point where I take inspiration from it. And he would say things like, explain to me what you're saying in words that like a 5-year-old would understand. And often they couldn't do it. And the lesson I take from Socrates, right, is that often when you really understand something, you can explain it simply. Right?
Right.
And often uh, ignorance or incomplete understanding hides itself behind profound sounding jargony language, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's intellectually important to be able to point that out, but I also think it's like morally and politically important because I think a lot of people um, sort of maintain their power in society and power over other people by sounding really jargony and abstract, like they know something you don't know, right? And
That's
this
true.
challenge of can you explain it to me like you're explaining it to a middle schooler? Um, uh, helps keep people honest and it helps keep people on equal footing. And so I find that a really intellectually, but also morally important thing to do.
Mhm. And to be fair, being able to explain something in like simple terms, being able to get to kind of like the meat of the issue is a form of eloquence in itself,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's often when people get to philosophy in school, the first paper they write, they think it's the opposite. They think they're supposed to sound very profound, biggest words they can think of, long, long sentences. And I tell them it's more powerful, it's shorter, punchier, simpler words, more forceful for that
Mhm.
reason.
Definitely. So then, do you think there's sort of like any merit still to reading these philosophical arguments in the more like, I guess, like convoluted or more wordy manner that the philosophers often originally write them in? So is there still some merit to kind of like experiencing them in that form and doing almost like the translation process yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, I don't want to just automatically say, because it's what a teacher is supposed to say, right? That of course you're
Yeah.
supposed to read the original text. Like there are some philosophers that I've decided I'm not going to read the primary text. I'm just going to have experts explain to me what they mean because I don't have the time, right? So
Mhm.
I think, there's totally value to doing that, right? Um, but I think that engaging with the primary text and wrestling through the ideas yourself is valuable because what you're doing when you study philosophy isn't just absorbing information like a sponge. Right?
Right.
You're having an experience of like cognitive growth where you are wrestling with difficult ideas and
Mhm.
trying out different avenues of thought that work and that don't work and then don't work and then work, right? And you're building intellectual virtues, right? And I tell students a lot, uh, and I mean this to be a little bit provocative, after you take a philosophy class, in 9 years, you're going to forget 90% of the information you learned.
Mhm.
So either philosophy is, or learning in general in school is not that important, right? Or the value of education isn't absorbing information. And that's what I think is the case, right? It's not about absorbing information, it's about growing the muscles in your mind, right? Because those
Right.
powers will stick even after you forget the information. And I think wrestling with the primary text, right, and trying to get into the head of the philosopher who's thinking through this idea for the first time, so they have that kind of beginner's mind about it, in a way that like a Wikipedia article wouldn't, right, helps build those muscles, um, and the lasting power of those muscles, right, in a way that just having a digested version of the ideas wouldn't.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely think that like going through the course sequence at OHS, especially, you learn some like those critical thinking skills, those kind of like ways to tackle a big problem and work out your own understanding of it, work out like what is really at the heart of the problem. It's a very important skill that applies to a lot of other courses and a lot of other things we generally meet in life as well.
Yeah, and if I can go on a bit of a tangent, something you said reminded me
Yeah.
of something a teacher of mine once said, which is philosophy studies all those questions that you can't Google the answer to. Um,
Agree.
because exactly, right? So imagine you Googled, do humans have free will? And Google said, yes, we do. And then you're like, great, well, I figured it out, right? That doesn't answer it for you at all because you need to, as you just said, find the answer to the question yourself. Right? And that's
Right.
not the same as saying that there are no answers in philosophy, and your opinion is as good as mine, and every position is equally good, and every argument is equally good. No, it's about saying that the sorts of things we're trying to get to at philosophy, you have to sort of walk down the intellectual road yourself, rather than being told the answer in the back of the book. Right? And the
Mhm.
value is more about the journey to getting toward your own belief on whether or not humans have free will, rather than just knowing the answer to it. And I think that's another way that like philosophy is morally and politically powerful, is because by definition, if philosophy is the sort of studies the sorts of questions you can't Google the answer to, then there aren't really authority figures in the traditional sense of like they have the answers. Right? So there's something kind of egalitarian about the study of philosophy. It empowers everybody in the room to say, there's not one person who can definitively tell you this is the answer to the question.
Yeah.
That's the negative. And on the positive, right,
Mhm.
it means that everyone's opinion and contribution and thought matters um, in a way that I think, especially for students who might have been in an environment in their lives where they've been signaled that their opinion doesn't matter. Right? It's
Mhm.
very empowering to be in a context where the main idea is that your thoughts matter and your opinions matter. Right? And it can help um, people claim the kind of um, uh, autonomy and self-respect and understanding of their own importance that other forms of education might kind of stamp out of them.
Yeah, it feels like something that can be really empowering. Feeling like you have kind of like the agency to feeling like you have the agency to have your thoughts kind of be contributive to this issue, because like everyone in, especially in these core classes, like every single person speaking in discussion is kind of like building their own ideas onto this philosophy. And we're kind of like
Right.
creating this philosophy and evolving the philosophy at the same time we're learning it and kind of discussing it.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that's great. So you cover like so many different areas in philosophy then, right? You have these different topics within philosophy, you have their like intersection with politics, international relation, you have like teaching philosophy. So what would you say overall are your favorite areas in philosophy?